Hello, I'm Barbara Okon of the Hebrew University, and today my colleague Eliyahu Ben Moshe and I will be discussing the demography of Israel, population dynamics and structure. We will present portraits of heterogeneous population groups in Israel and their evolution over time. We will also touch upon the social causes and consequences of demographic change. While Israeli population dynamics share common contours with global patterns of demographic change, the constellation of demographic patterns in Israel is unique in several ways. We will begin by describing Israel's major societal divisions between two nationality groups, Palestinian Arabs, referred to here as Arabs, and Jews. In this lecture, we refer to Palestinian Arabs as those Arabs living within the boundaries of the State of Israel and not including Palestinians living in the occupied territories. Patterns of population change within the Arab and Jewish populations of Israel have been closely connected with Israel's political conflicts and ideational history and differ in important ways. Arabs in Israel are a heterogeneous minority. In terms of their population size, Arabs account for slightly over 1/5 of the total population of Israel. Around the time of the war and establishment of the state in 1948, most Arabs were expelled or fled from their homes or were displaced within what would become the borders of the State of Israel. Although formally, Arabs who live within the internationally recognized borders of Israel have citizenship status, they are subject to various forms of discrimination in education and employment, which have contributed to their social and economic disadvantage vis-a-vis the Jewish majority. The Arab population is also characterized by clear residential segregation from Jews. The majority population in Israel is Jewish. The adult Jewish population of Israel today is largely comprised of a heterogeneous group of immigrants, their children, and their grandchildren, and its history has been influenced greatly by waves of immigration, which were especially large following the foundation of the state in 1948. Israel is ranked by the United Nations as among the very high development countries in terms of income, education, and health. For example, its income puts it at about 75% of the OECD average, just below Korea. Israel is ranked near the highest among OECD countries in terms of the proportions of persons aged 25 to 64 with tertiary level education, higher than that in the United States and even Japan, and significantly above the OECD average. Women's labor force participation is also high, particularly among mothers with young children, and the division of household labor in Israel is relatively egalitarian. Life expectancy in Israel is also very high, 83 years for women and 80 for men, thus matching or exceeding that of many northern, western, and southern European countries. Despite its high overall rankings in terms of socioeconomic development, the population of Israel is extremely heterogeneous along many dimensions. Now, my colleague Eliyahu Ben Moshe will present to you the three themes in demography of Israel, which will form the framework of the rest of our lecture.
Thank you, Barbara. Three themes characterize Israeli demography, and we will return to them during this lecture. The first, extraordinarily high levels of demographic phenomenon, including very high population growth. Second, rapid change in terms of immigration waves, fertility change, mortality decline. And third, heterogeneous demographic behavior of numerically important social groups. We shall begin now with a snapshot of how Israel looks today. Israel is a Middle Eastern country on the Mediterranean Sea. It is about the same area as the state of New Jersey, which is one of the smallest states in the United States. Is its area big or small? As we can see, the territory of Israel is very small in compared with other countries, both countries more developed and less developed all over the world. Population size is also relatively small, but not as small as population area is small when compared with other countries. As a consequence, population growth in Israel is, as we said before, very, very high when compared with other countries. Just to give us an idea and to illustrate that, we will introduce the concept of doubling time. Doubling time answers to the question of what is the time that takes, given a fixed rate of population growth, to the population to double itself. In the case of Israel, 2%, it will take 35 times to double its population. That means that every 35 years, we will have twice as many cars, twice as many schools, twice as many people entering the labor market, twice as many new apartments that will need to be built. And this is, when compared with the United States, a very, very quick doubling time. In the United States, it will take 100 years to double the population. In Russia, it will take 350 years to double its population.
Eliyahu described the high rates of population growth which have characterized Israel in recent years. If we look historically at population growth rates since the foundation of the state in 1948, then average growth rates annually are even higher, 3.5%. And this translates into a doubling time of only 20 years and explains why the population of Israel has doubled more than 3 times since 1948. Now I would like to discuss what are the sources of those population growth rates. While average growth rates in the Jewish and Arab populations are similar, the source of the population growth differ. Large net in-migration accounted for a substantial proportion of Jewish population growth during the period 1948 to 2014, while among Arabs, net migration was negligible. Natural increase, that is births minus deaths, accounts for the high rates of population growth among Arabs. And in recent years, both Arabs and Jews grow as a consequence of high natural increase, originating in high fertility and low mortality rates. Since immigration is a key factor in understanding the source of population growth among Jews in Israel, I would like to take a few minutes to describe the waves of Jewish immigrants to the area which is now the State of Israel. Since 1880, when the Jewish population in the area which is now the State of Israel totaled fewer than 25,000, great waves of immigration occurred, both in relation to the number of Jews in the world and in relation to the size of the local population. Jewish immigration to Israel has had very diverse origins, including many parts of the Islamic world, of West Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, as well as origins in Eastern and Central Europe and the Americas. Completely different circumstances and hundreds, sometimes thousands of years of mutual disconnection led to wide gaps between Jews of different ethnic origins in terms of different languages, values, customs, politics, economics, technology, culture, and demographic patterns. About 500,000 Jewish immigrants arrived to pre-state Israel. Most of the Jews living in Israel in 1948, just before statehood, were immigrants or the descendant of immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe. This Jewish population was enlarged by an additional 700,000 immigrants by 1951. This mass migration wave during the first years of statehood included a large number of Jews from the Islamic world who had been a small minority in pre-state Israel. Later, waves of North African Jews left their home countries in reaction to French decolonization around 1960, and about half of these 450,000 Jews arrived in Israel. Immigrants who arrived between 1948 and 1967 totaled 1.2 million. During the 1970s and 80s, immigration streams continued at much lower levels. Most recently, there was another large wave of immigration beginning in 1990. Between 1990 and 2002, approximately 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union arrived in Israel, then a nation of roughly 7 million. Over time, ethnic flux in Israel has led to the evolution of new ethnic groups. For example, a broadening of the basis of ethnicity has resulted in the creation of a pan-ethnic identity, Israelis of Middle Eastern or North African origin, known in Hebrew as Mizrahim, or persons of Eastern origin. It is likely that the creation of a pan-ethnic identity came about despite cultural and socioeconomic diversity among Israelis of Middle Eastern and North African descent, because of broad differences between these groups and the groups from Eastern and Central Europe, Ashkenazim, in terms of socioeconomic status, residential location, and cultural and religious practices. Despite the immigration of Jews from diverse origin, Israeli society has been dominated by Ashkenazim. Some of these were Jews who were the first to immigrate to pre-independence Israel and were the founders of most political, economic, and cultural institutions. In general, Jewish immigrants from Muslim countries in North Africa and the Middle East were characterized by lower levels of socioeconomic status, as well as higher levels of fertility and mortality. For a variety of reasons, including differential placement of newly arrived immigrants in geographically and economically peripheral regions, as well as differential veteranship in Israel, Mizrahim have generally been disadvantaged socioeconomically. The split between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim has become a dominant one in contemporary Israeli Jewish society, especially because it is understood largely in terms of class inequality and historical discrimination. Most recently, the last large wave of immigrants from the former Soviet Union has changed the face of Israeli society and added to the mosaic of Jewish society, marked by different cultures, languages, levels of socioeconomic status, and demographic regimes.
Based on aggregate statistics, the population of Israel has, compared to other developed societies, as well as most developing societies, has very high levels of fertility and marriage. However, studying aggregate demographic measures is problematic because Israel is an extremely heterogeneous society with family formation patterns differing greatly across numerically important social groups. There are significant differences in demographic patterns between the minority Arab, primarily Muslim population, and the majority Jewish population. Moreover, there is great heterogeneity in demographic patterns within the Arab and Jewish populations by religion, religiosity, and ethnic origin. What is fertility transition? Fertility transition is a general term used to describe a decades or century-long trend towards reducing fertility from high to low levels. Usually we refer to fertility transition occurring at the national or regional or provincial level. Fertility transition does not refer to relatively short-term fluctuations up or down in fertility, but to more long-term trends from high to low. Generally, historically, these fertility declines have been called transitions because once the decline has begun, it rarely reverses itself so that fertility does not ever go back to high levels again. Usually, the historical process has been that of the reduction from high to medium to low levels. Some fertility declines have occurred very fast while others have taken much more time. The fertility transition can be seen as part of broader demographic change understood in the framework of the demographic transition. As we can see, Arabs seem to have experienced fertility transition, and there has been a great convergence to levels close to those of the Jewish population.
Other groups in Israel have also experienced fertility transition. For example, we see here fertility decline among the Mizrahi population in Israel following their immigration. And we also see that there has been a reduction in the gap between the level of Mizrahi fertility as compared to Ashkenazi fertility. On the other hand, fertility among other groups in Israel remains high. And in this slide, I would like to discuss the important differentials in fertility across groups defined by religiosity in the Jewish population. A discussion of religiosity groups in the Jewish population in Israel can be organized around categories of Jewish religiosity, which correspond with well-defined social constructs. Although there is variation within these broadly defined groups, distinctions are made among the following numerically important groups: the ultra-Orthodox, the religious, the traditional, and the secular or non-religious. It is generally quite well understood what these groups mean, both socially and in terms of religious practice. Thus, we take these groups as our starting points in the discussion of religiosity within the Jewish-Israeli context here, as well as in the graphs that we will show below. The ultra-Orthodox in Israel have a commitment to extreme segregation from the secular world in general, and in particular from Jewish Israeli society, which is largely secular in nature. The ultra-Orthodox groups stem from a contra-acculturation movement which developed during the period of Enlightenment in Europe. The ultra-Orthodox shun all contact with outside culture and essentially form a separate society. For example, ultra-Orthodox men often study in yeshivot, religious schools, until the age of 40. They do not generally study secular subjects. They have very low labor force participation rates, and they do not usually perform the military service that is mandatory for other Jewish men. While ultra-Orthodox women may have greater contact with Israeli society than their male counterparts, their behavior is also more limited than among secular women, and their labor force participation is generally lower than that of other women. Likewise, community norms prohibit any exposure to secular culture in the form of mass media and internet for men, women, and children, and social norms are enforced from within by neighbors and by community members through social surveillance and the threat of rejection by the group. The strict adherence to a very particular, constrained way of life on the part of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel must also be understood in the context of the powerful religious institution and leaders in Israel. Politically, the ultra-Orthodox groups are organized and have formed the balance between the two large political parties on the left and the right. This strategic political position has empowered religious leaders and enabled the ultra-Orthodox to receive much general government assistance in terms of financial support. Nonetheless, this group is among the poorest segments of the Israeli population. Based on recent data, approximately 7.5% of adult Jewish men and women define themselves as ultra-Orthodox. And among these groups, women have had on average between 6 and 8 children in recent decades. In contrast to the ultra-Orthodox, the national religious movement originated during Enlightenment in the acculturation groups that promoted contact with the outside world while maintaining Jewish culture and practices. These religious Jews are generally well integrated into Jewish Israeli secular society. They participate in major institutions such as the military. Their school system teaches secular as well as religious subjects. They participate in secular post-secondary study, and they have high labor force participation rates, both among men and women. Persons who see themselves as part of the national religious movement are likely to self-identify as religious, but not ultra-Orthodox. Based on recent studies, approximately 10 to 11% of adult Jewish men and women self-identify as religious. And religious women have been shown to have approximately 4 children on average. An additional approximately 40% of Jewish adults define themselves as traditional. Traditional Jews in Israel do not define themselves as strictly religious or ultra-Orthodox, and not as secular. Generally, traditional Jews do fulfill some religious commandments and maintain Jewish customs. However, their traditional behavior is not necessarily motivated only by religious commitment, but may also be associated with identification and affiliation with the Jewish people or with their Jewish ethnic group, community, or family. Self-defined traditional women have completed fertility in the range of 2.5 to 3.5 children each, with a slight downward trend noticeable. The largest group of adult Jews in Israel, approximately 40%, define themselves as secular or not religious. We note that even these secular women report that they do observe some religious commandments. They do attend synagogue for major holidays, and they rate religious ceremonies as very important in their lives. This would seem to suggest that even self-defined secular Jews in Israel are not completely secularized. Secular women in Israel have the lowest number of children on average among all Jewish religiosity groups, but maintain levels that are higher than in most developed societies. This graph shows fertility levels and trends among Jews by levels of religiosity. We note here the strikingly high levels of fertility among the ultra-Orthodox, and also the much lower but still high levels of fertility among religious Jews. We also note that there is a very close association between level of religiosity and fertility level.
The Israeli Arab population is subdivided into three subgroups characterized by different religions. The vast majority is Muslim, 84% of the total Arab population of Israel, while the Christian and Druze population comprised about 8% each. Long-term differences in socioeconomic status between Muslim and Christian Arab groups, which emerged roughly 100 years ago in various societies, have been noted as a general characteristic of the Middle East. Differences between these population groups took the form of higher educational attainment, higher status of women, lower child mortality, greater urbanization, and more exposure to the West among the Christian Arabs. Druze used to be more similar to the Muslim population several generations ago, but in the last generation they became closer to the Christian Arabs in their socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. As we can see from the graph, there was a great heterogeneity in fertility by religion in the Arab group. However, we can see a high convergence in the last 2 decades, and we can see that Muslim fertility that was very high in the past is already getting to the levels of the Druze and Christian fertility. As we have seen changes over time in fertility, as well as great heterogeneity in fertility levels across groups and recent convergence, we can now look at mortality change. Life expectancy overall, as compared with other selected countries, show that Israel mortality is low in international standards. In recent years, life expectancy of men in Israel is about 80 years, and for women is nearly 84 years. As we can see, over the years, expectancy of life was increasing in Israel as in all other countries in general, and more developed countries in particular, and both for men and for women. When we compare the different groups in terms of infant mortality, we can see that in general there is a trend downwards in infant mortality in all population groups, but there is still heterogeneity, with Muslims having the highest IMR infant mortality rates, Druze somewhat lower, and Christians and Jews the lowest levels of infant mortality rates. Though thus we see convergence, but the gaps remain by religious. We have looked at trends over time in migration, fertility, and mortality. How do historical patterns result in population structure that we see today? The age pyramid for all of Israel as compared with US and Uganda, show clearly that Israel is closer in some terms to Uganda than to the United States. In general, age pyramids has many social consequences. For example, age structure is an important factor in economic growth. Israel's pyramid in practice looks like a combination of the Uganda's wide base and US upper section. The wide base reflects high fertility levels, and the top part, the early stages of the aging of the Israel's baby boom generation. Having a high proportion of children and a substantial proportion of old persons implies that the working age population is relatively small, and therefore the economic burden on the working age population to support children and older people is heavy. When we compare the population pyramids of different groups in Israel, we note significant variation, reflecting primarily differences in fertility across groups. Muslims have had historically high fertility, leading to a wide base, and ultra-Orthodox even more so. The population pyramid among secular Jews is more rectangular, reflecting their lower fertility. We have talked about the characteristics of the Israeli population and the main demographic processes that Israeli population experienced in the last years. Now we'll talk a bit about the future. Population projections allow us to get some insights about what will happen in the next decades. From what we can see, the population of Israel is going to continue its rapid growth, and therefore the increase in population density is for granted, and those will happen during a process of rapid aging when the baby boomers would arrive to the pension or retirement ages. That will reflect in high dependency overall because of the high levels of fertility that still remain relatively high.
Thank you, Eliyahu. Just like to summarize and sum up our lecture by going back to the three themes in the demography of Israel that Eliyahu discussed before. The exceptionally high population growth with average annual growth rates over time, which leads to a doubling time of 20 years on average during the period since 1948. Rapid population change, for example, with large waves of immigration, with Jews coming from diverse origin. Fertility change, for example, fertility transition among the Arabs in Israel and among Mizrahim. Mortality change, which has led to improvements in life expectancy, but still reflects inequality and gaps across groups, and very heterogeneous demographic behavior across social groups. Israel has been and still is a demographic laboratory, experiencing many demographic changes that are experienced in other places across the globe, but unusual in the high rates of immigration and population growth and in population heterogeneity in demographic parameters.